Hello, Slumber Seekers, and welcome to the Slumber Tales podcast, where we read to you some of our favorite stories. My name is Finian Schwarz, and I'll be your storyteller tonight. If you have a favorite story that you'd like us to read, share it with us. You can leave a comment if that's available, or email us at myslumbertales@gmail.com. That's myslumbertales@gmail.com. Now, without further ado, let's jump into our story for tonight. Chapter 17. Who are these strange black dogs? The Dearlys, the Nannies, and Perdita had spent a sad, sad Christmas Eve. They had all been very kind to each other. Perdita had washed the humans so much that they all had chapped hands and had to use gallons of hand lotion. Fortunately, Perdita quite liked the taste of this. She had received no news by the way of the twilight barking. Reception was bad at that part of Regent's Park, which is why Pongo had done his barking and listening on Primrose Hill. In the afternoon, the Nannies trimmed the Christmas tree. They said it was for Perdita, but they really hoped to cheer the Dearlys up. The Dearlys put Perdita's present on it, but they had not the heart to get out the presents which they had bought for Pongo, Mrs., and the 15 puppies, just in case they all came home. Mr. Dearly had guessed that Pongo and Mrs. were searching for their family, but he now feared that family might be scattered all over England, and the best he really hoped for was that Pongo and Mrs. might return. When snow first began to fall, everyone felt worse than ever. "And Mrs. didn't even take her coat," said Mrs. Dearly. She pictured Pongo and Mrs. lost, shivering and starving. So did Mr. Dearly, but they kept the horrid thought to themselves. In the evening, the Dearlys invited the Nannies to come up to the drawing room, and they all played nursery card games: Snap, Beggar My Neighbor, and Animal Grab. They all pretended to enjoy themselves, which was very hard work. At last, Mr. Dearly said he would put some carols on the gramophone. Now, carols are always beautiful, but if you are sad, they can make you feel sadder. There are some people who always find beauty makes them feel sadder, which is a very mysterious thing. Soon, the Dearlys and the Nannies could hardly keep the tears out of their eyes. When Mr. Dearly realized this, he thought, "This must be the last carol we play." It was Silent Night. Mrs. Dearly put out the lights and drew back the curtains at the tall windows so they could see the stars while they listened, and she saw it was snowing again. She went back to the sofa and stroked Perdita, who, for once, did no washing but just gazed at the falling snow. The voices singing Silent Night were high and clear and peaceful, and not very loud. Suddenly, everyone in the room heard a dog bark. "That's Pongo!" cried Mr. Dearly, and dashed to the window. "That's Mrs.!" cried Mrs. Dearly, hearing a different bark as she, too, dashed to the window. They flung the window open wide and stared down through the swirling snow. And then their hearts seemed turned to lead by disappointment. Down below were 2 black dogs. Mrs. Dearly said gently, "You shouldn't be out on a night like this. Go home to your owners, my dears." She used the word owners when she really should have said pets, that mistake humans so often make. The dogs barked again, but Mr. Dearly said, "Home!" very firmly, for he felt sure the dogs lived somewhere near and had been let out for a last run before going into bed. He shut the window, saying to Mrs. Dearly, "Odd-looking dogs. I can't quite recognize the breed." He did not hear the despairing howl that came from Mrs. It had happened, just as she had feared. They were turned away, outcasts in the night. Pongo had a moment of panic. This was something he had not foreseen, but quickly he pulled himself together. "We must bark again," he said, "and much louder."
"Shall the puppies bark too?" suggested Mrs.
The puppies were all lined up out of sight from the window because Pongo felt that so many dogs at once might come as a bit of a shock. He now said, "No, only you and I must bark, Mrs., and one at a time. Then they will recognize our voices sooner or later. We would recognize theirs, whatever clothes they wore, whatever color their faces and hands were." So he barked again, and then Mrs. barked. They went on, taking it in turns. Up in the drawing room, Mrs. Dearly said,
"I can't believe that's not Pongo and Mrs., and look how excited Perdita is."
"It's because we're all longing so to hear them," said Mr. Dearly. "We imagine we do. But there must be something wrong with those black dogs. Just listen to them. Perhaps they're lost."
And again he opened the window. Pongo and Mrs. barked louder than ever and wagged their tails wildly.
"Anyone would think they knew us," said Mr. Dearly. "I shall go down and see if they have collars on. Perhaps I can take them to their homes."
Pongo heard this and said to Mrs. quickly, "The moment the door opens, dash in and lead the way up to the drawing room. Pups, you follow Mrs., noses to tails. I will bring up the rear. And never let there be one moment when Mr. Dearly can close the front door. Once we're in, we can make them understand." The front door opened, and out came Mr. Dearly. In shot Mrs., closely followed by the Cadpig, now out of her cart, and all her brothers and sisters, except Lucky, who insisted on waiting with Pongo. What with the darkness and the whirling snow, Mr. Dearly did not see what was happening until a pup bumped into him in passing. It was Roly-Poly, of course. Then he looked down to see what had bumped him, and saw a steady stream of black pups going through the front door, and the white hall, and up the white stairs.
"I'm definitely dreaming this,"
thought Mr. Dearly, and pinched himself hard. But the stream of pups went on and on. Suddenly there was a hitch. The two pups, faithfully dragging the Cadpig's little blue cart, now empty, could not get it up the steps. Mr. Dearly, who could never see a dog in difficulty without helping him, at once picked the cart up himself. After seeing the cart, he no longer felt he was dreaming.
"These dogs are a troupe from a circus," he thought. "But why have they come to us?"
A moment later, Pongo and Lucky went past, and the stream of dogs stopped. Mr. Dearly called into the night,
Any more out there?"
To his relief, no dogs answered. So he went in and closed the door. Pongo's sooty hindquarters were just round the bend of the stairs. Mr. Dearly followed 4 steps at a time, still carrying the little blue cart. The scene in the front drawing room was rather confused. Large as the room was, there was not floor space for all the puppies, so they were jumping on the tables and chairs and piling up on top of each other. There was rather a lot of noise. Mrs. Dearly was just managing to keep on her feet. She had never been frightened of any dog in her life, but she did feel a trifle startled. The nannies had taken refuge on top of the grand piano. Mr. Dearly took one look through the door, then dashed into the black drawing room and flung open the double doors. A sea of pups surged in, and now that there was a little spare floor space, Pongo barked a command. "All pups who can find space, roll! Roll, missus!" And he himself rolled with a will. The Dearlys stared in utter bewilderment, and then both of them shouted. "Look! Look!" The white carpet was becoming blacker. The black dogs were becoming whiter.
"It's Pongo!"
cried Mr. Dearly.
"It's Mrs."
cried Mrs. Dearly. "It's Pongo, Mrs. and all their puppies!" cried the nannies from on top of the piano.
"It's considerably more than all their puppies,"
said Mr. Dearly, just before Pongo forcibly embraced him. Mrs. was embracing Mrs. Dearly, and in a corner of the room there was a great deal more embracing. Perdita was going absolutely wild, trying to embrace 8 puppies at once. There were her own long-lost family.
It had never struck Pongo that they might be among the rescued pups. He had not even noticed their brown spots, because he had scarcely seen any of the pups by daylight before they all rolled in the soot. It turned out that Perdita's family was the one that fitted the Cadpig's little blue cart so well and had pulled it so faithfully. Mr. Dearly had put the cart down in the black drawing room, and the nannies had now got off the piano and gone to look at it.
"It's a child's toy," said Nanny Cook.
"And it's got a name and address on it,"
said Nanny Butler, and she read out,
"Master Tommy Tompkins Farmer, Dimpling, Suffolk."
"Dimpling?" said Mrs. Dearly. "That's where Cruella de Vil has a country house. She told us about it when we had dinner with her and asked if we'd like to buy it."
And then Mr. Dearly saw it all. He remembered Cruella's desire for a Dalmatian fur coat, guessed that she had collected all these pups so that Mr. de Vil could make many such coats.
"You must have the lore on her. Yes, absolutely must,"
cried the nannies. Mr. Dearly said he would think about that after Christmas, but now he must think about feeding the pups when all the shops were closed. He hurriedly telephoned the Ritz, the Savoy, Claridge's, and other rather good hotels, and asked them to send page boys along with steaks. The hotels were most anxious to help when they heard that the missing Dalmatians had come home.
"And at least 6,000 more than I ever hoped for,"
said Mr. Dearly, not that he had had time to count the pups. Nanny Butler said,
"They must be bathed before they eat."
"Bathed?" gasped Mrs. Dearly. "All of them?"
"They can't sleep in their soot," said Nanny Cook firmly. "Nanny Butler and I will work in our bathroom, and you two can work in yours. And how about asking that splendid vet and his wife to pop round and bathe pups in the laundry?" So Mr. Dearly rang up the splendid vet, who was delighted to be woken up and called out at nearly midnight on Christmas Eve. He and his wife arrived in a few minutes. Mrs. Dearly got out all her best bath salts and bath oils and all the lovely colored bath towels given to her as wedding presents. The nannies lit fires in every room. Then the 3 bathing teams got to work. Soon the house was filled with steam and the scent of lilac, roses, and jasmine, mixed with the delightful smell of wet dogs. It took less time than you would believe, because 5 pups were put in a bath at a time. They were then wrapped in pink, blue, yellow, and green towels and carried to blazing fires to dry. Mr. Dearly thoughtfully turned the drawing-room carpet over so that the soot on it would not come off on the clean pups. By the time the last pup was washed, the steaks were arriving. There were enough for everyone, even the humans, who were by this time pretty hungry. They had theirs cooked. At last, the splendid vet and his wife went home, and the house settled for the night. Pongo and Mrs. showed plainly that they wanted to sleep in their own baskets, with their puppies round them on the hearth rug and in armchairs. Perdita took her little lot into the laundry on a rather good satin eiderdown. The other pups slept all over the house, on beds, sofas, and chairs. The Dearlys and the nannies managed to keep chairs for themselves, rather hard ones, but they did not mind, because they did not expect to sleep much. They wanted to be on hand in case any pup needed anything in the night. When all was quiet in the firelit kitchen, and the 15 pups were asleep, Pongo said to Mrs., "Do you remember the night we left? How we looked back at this kitchen? Look now at your legal collar on its peg, ready for you to wear tomorrow, and your beautiful blue coat."
Mrs. said, "I'm so hardy now that I shall not need this coat, but I shall wear it for vanity." At that moment they heard a little noise at the window. A little scratching noise.
Outside, in the midst of a white blur, were two green eyes. It was Cruella's white cat. Swiftly Pongo let her in.
"Such goings on at the DeVilles!"
she cried. Quickly, Pongo turned to his wife. "I haven't explained to you yet, Mrs. Our friend here told me that if we could get into that bolted room, we could destroy Mr. DeVille's whole stock of furs. Cruella made him keep them all there, so that she could wear any she fancied. I hoped we might put an end to this furrier business. That was why I took the risk of going into the DeVille's house. Not to be revenged, but to make England safe for Dalmatians."
"And it's even better than I hoped,"
said the white cat.
"because, as it turns out, most of the furs weren't paid for, so Mr. DeVille's ruined."
"The poor little man," said Mrs. "I feel quite sorry for him."
"No need to," said the white cat. "He's as bad as Cruella. The only difference is she's strong and bad, and he's weak and bad. Anyway, they're going to leave England tomorrow to get away from their debts."
"Cruella still has her jewels," said Mrs. regretfully.
"Mostly sham,"
said the white cat.
"and those that aren't will be needed for Mr. DeVille to start another business abroad. He says he's going to make plastic raincoats."
"Cruella won't look very well in those," said Mrs. cheerfully.
"She won't look very well in anything. You've heard of people's hair going white in a single night from shock? That's happened to the black side of her hair, and the white side's gone green, a horrid shade. People are going to think it's dyed. Well, I'm glad to have finished with the DeVilles."
"But where will you go?" asked Pongo.
"Go? I shan't go anywhere. I've just come. Here. I'd have come long ago if you dogs hadn't barked. That night your pets gave me a kind sardine. They won't turn me out. I'll pop up and find them now."
Then Pongo and Mrs. sank into a blissful sleep, without a care in the world, except that they did want to know what the Dearleys were going to do with so many puppies. And so did the Dearleys. Those listeners who also want to know should listen on. Besides, there is a mystery to be cleared up. Most people who are good at arithmetic are likely to think there is a mistake in this book. It is called the 101 Dalmatians. Well, Pongo and Mrs. and Perdita make 3, and there were 97 Dalmatian pups at Hell Hall, including those belonging to Pongo, Mrs. and Perdita. 3 and 97 make 100. Where then is the 101st Dalmatian? He has been mentioned, but many listeners may not remember him. Those who do not shall soon be reminded of him, and those who do shall soon learn more about him. On to the last chapter, if you please. Chapter 18. The 101st Dalmatian. Christmas Day at the house in Regent's Park was absolutely wonderful. The rather good hotels sent plenty more steaks, and though there were not, of course, enough presents to go round, the pups were able to play with lots of things in the house which were not intended to be played with, but were played with ever afterwards. The Dearleys took all the pups into the snowy park. Pongo, Mrs. and Perdita circled round to make sure not one got lost, and at twilight, Pongo and Mrs. firmly led the Dearleys up to the top of Primrose Hill and barked over a dogdom-wide network. They even managed to get a message through to the gallant old spaniel, for 2 dogs from a village 5 miles from him made a special trip in order to bark to him. He sent a message back that he and his dear old pet were very well. Of course, the dogdom-wide barking was relayed. The furthest away dog Pongo and Mrs. spoke to directly was the Brigadier General Great Dane over towards Hampstead, who was in great barking form.
"There is something very mysterious about this barking at twilight," said Mrs. Dearly. "Do you think they are sending messages?"
Mr. Dearly said it was a charming idea, but... And then he stopped. Was anything beyond dogs? Not when he thought of all Pongo and Mrs. had done. How had they got 97 pups back from Suffolk? Pongo and Mrs. longed to tell him, but they never could. As soon as Christmas was over, Mr. Dearly decided to act quickly, for he realized that 100 Dalmatians was too much for one house in Regent's Park. It was even a bit much for Regent's Park. First, he advertised, in case any of the rightful owners of pups wanted to claim them, but none did, for this reason. Cruella had bought all the pups, except those stolen from the Dearlys, because it costs a lot to get any expert stealing done these days. Cruella had paid more to the dog thieves who stole from the Dearlys than for any litter she had bought. And naturally, people who had sold puppies never thought of them as lost, or did anything more about them. Only one owner turned up, the farmer who had owned Perdita, and he was quite happy to sell her to the Dearlys. So there was Mr. Dearly, lucky man, with 100 delightful Dalmatians. He decided he must take a large country house. Happily, he could afford this, as the government had again got itself into debt, and he had again got it out. And this time he had been rewarded by an income to save his income tax on. So he had retired from business, except for being always ready to help the government with its sums. One fine day in January, when the snow was all gone, he said to Mrs. Dearly,
"Let's drive out to Suffolk and return the little blue cart to Master Tommy Tompkins, and also hunt for a country house. And we'll have a look at the house where the puppies were imprisoned. Not that we'll take that one."
Mrs. Dearly laughed at such an idea. They took Pongo and Mrs. with them, and Lucky came as a stowaway, under a seat, because he wanted to see the sheepdog again and be made a captain. He didn't stay under the seat long, and everyone was delighted to see him when he came out. When they reached Dimpling, they went for a walk round the village, and met Tommy Tompkins out with the sheepdog. So the little blue cart was returned then and there. Rather a relief to the Dearlys, who wouldn't quite have known what to say to Tommy's parents. They didn't have to say anything to Tommy, as he still wasn't quite talking, though his chuckling noises were at least beginning to sound more like human than like dog. The Dearlys saw at once that Pongo, Mrs. and Lucky knew the sheepdog and the tabby cat that came hurrying up.
"And now we'll find Cruella's house,"
said Mr. Dearly. When they got to Hell Hall, there was a large notice outside saying, "For sale, cheap, owner gone to warm climate," and the gates stood wide open. The house was empty. The Baden brothers were now in jail for assaulting the man who came to take away the television, which had never been paid for. They weren't minding jail much, because meeting so many criminals was almost better than television, and now they had high hopes of one day appearing on What's My Crime.
"What a hideous house," said Mrs. Dearly.
"What a lovely wall,"
said Mr. Dearly. One thing had been worrying him. If he took 100 Dalmatians into the country, how was he to prevent them from running wild? This magnificent wall was just the thing. If only the house were not so hideous.
"Suppose it was painted white," he said, "and the blocked-up windows were put back. There's a lovely pond in front, almost a lake."
Mrs. Dearly shook her head, but when they got into the house and saw the fine, large rooms and imagined them all white instead of all red, she began to feel differently. Pongo, Mrs. and Lucky raced through the kitchen and larder, remembering all that had happened there. The Dearlys followed them and saw the furnace for the central heating. Then they all went to the stables.
"These would make fine kennels if they were heated,"
said Mr. Dearly.
Then he looked up and saw the folly, and both he and Mrs. Dearly took a fancy to it, and they decided then and there to buy Hell Hall and make it into a beautiful house.
"Here we will found a dynasty of Dalmatians,"
said Mr. Dearly. Mrs. was insulted. She thought the word meant a nasty din, but Pongo explained that it meant a family that goes on and on. Mr. Dearly added,
"And we'd better start a dynasty of Dearlys to look after the dynasty of Dalmatians."
And Mrs. Dearly quite agreed. The alterations to Hell Hall were quickly made, and one sunny day in early spring, a removal van and an extra-large double-decker motor coach stood outside the house in Regent's Park. The van was for the furniture, the coach was for the Dearlys and the Dalmatians. The nannies had already gone down by car to open Hell Hall, Nanny Butler driving. She had added a smart chauffeur's cap to her butler's outfit. Mr. Dearly came out of the house with Pongo and Mrs. Mrs. Dearly followed with Perdita, and with the white cat on her shoulder. The white cat, too, was to start a dynasty at Hell Hall. The Dearlys had promised her a white Persian husband. Within the next few minutes, two surprising things happened. First, just as Mrs. saw the removal van and said,
"Oh, there's a miracle!"
a Staffordshire Terrier flung itself from the van, said,
"Here we are again,"
to Pongo and Mrs., and hurled itself at Mr. Dearly's chest. "That's a compliment if you only knew it," said Jim, who was standing by the van. "That's right," said Bill. "Old battering ram's fallen for you." "And I for him," said Mr. Dearly politely, rising from a sitting position. Pongo and Mrs. managed to quieten the Staffordshire Terrier before he paid any compliments to Mrs. Dearly, and then the second surprising thing happened. A large car had drawn up, and the people in it were looking at Pongo, Mrs., and Perdita with interest. Suddenly, there was a wild commotion in the car, and then the door burst open, and out sprang a superb liver-spotted Dalmatian. He dashed up to Perdita. It was her long-lost husband. His name was Prince. The people in the big car were much touched by his faithfulness to Perdita, and at once offered him to the Dearlys, saying they would be glad of a good home for him, as they were always going abroad and having to leave him in kennels. Prince was delighted. Apart from wanting to be with Perdita, he knew good pets when he saw them. So the Dalmatians started for Suffolk, 101 strong. They all sat up on the motor coach seats, looking out of the window, and many people who saw them pass cheered, for there had been so much about them in the papers that they were now quite famous. And many, many dogs lined the route, as word of the journey had gone out by twilight barking. The waiting dogs barked their good wishes, and the Dalmatians barked their thanks. So it was rather noisy in the motor coach. The Dearlys didn't mind. They thought happy barking was a pleasant noise. Prince was rather shy at first, so Mr. Dearly sat beside him and punched him, in a way some big dogs like to be punched. The punching needs to be hard enough, but not too hard. It must please and not hurt. Mr. Dearly was a highly skilled dog puncher. Prince thumped his tail, then suddenly gave Mr. Dearly's ear a playful nip, which was much appreciated. After that, Perdita's handsome husband felt he was completely one of the family. When the Dalmatians reached the village of Dimpling, all the villagers were out to receive them, with the sheepdog, the tabby cat, and Tommy Tompkins well to the fore. The cows were lowing a lovely welcome from the farm. Tommy had his little blue cart with him, and the Cadpig felt just a bit envious, but she was happy to know she had grown too strong to need any cart. The white Persian cat, who was now a charming creature, kindness makes kind cats, was extremely gracious to the farmyard tabby. It was the beginning
of a firm friendship. At last the motor coach drove in through the wide open gates of Hell Hall. The pond now reflected a snow-white house with muslin curtains at the windows. The front of the house still seemed like a face and had an expression, but now it was a pleasant expression. The nannies were waiting at the open front door. As they came to meet the Dearlys, Nanny Butler said, "Do you know there's a television aerial on the roof of this house?" And Nanny Cook said, "Seems wasteful not to make use of it." Then Mr. Dearly knew that the nannies wished for a television in the kitchen, and he at once suggested it. Pongo and Mrs. were delighted, for they knew how very much their smallest daughter had missed it. But during the many happy hours the Cadpig was to sit watching it in the warm kitchen, she never liked it quite so much as that other television, that still, silent television she had seen on Christmas Eve, when the puppies had rested so peacefully in the strange, lofty building. She often remembered that building and wondered who owned it. Someone very kind, she was sure. For in front of every one of the many seats there had been a little carpet-eared, puppy-sized dog bed. The end. My name is Finian Schwarz, and I'd like to thank you ever so much for listening to the 101 Dalmatians, written by Dodie Smith. This reading was dedicated to Jiva.